Mr. Dragoo is going to speak today on Pascal's Wager, a gambler's commentary. Please welcome Mr. Dragoo.
All right. The text today is Pascal's Wager. I'm going to I have this whole talk written out, but I don't like reading talks. I like talking to people. So I'll do my best to bounce back and forth between making sure I say all the things I wanted to say, but saying them in as natural a way as possible. This text, Pascal's Wager, was found among the fragmentary texts that were published posthumously under the title of the Pensées, the Thoughts. That's this book right here. It is thought that Pascal was assembling these fragmentary texts to be published eventually as a text presenting an apology for the Christian religion. But he died before he was able to accomplish this. The Pensées was first assembled, ordered, and published in 1670, 8 years after his death. But through the years, scholars have disagreed about the order in which they should have been read, and therefore they have been published in several different orders in various editions throughout the years. The fragment that came to be known as the Wager is known by scholars as the Infini Rien fragment, which are just its first words, infinity, nothing. This fragment is described by a Canadian philosopher of science, Ian Hacking, in 1972 as consisting of two pieces of paper covered on both sides by handwriting going in all directions, full of erasures, corrections, insertions, and afterthoughts. I was able to actually locate an image of that. It looks like this. There's the camera. This is the front and back of the first of the two pages. So there's two of these, front and back, so a total of 4 sheets. And right there at the top, you can see it says in very bad handwriting, Infini Rien, infinity, nothing. And that comes to be the title of the fragment, which we now call colloquially just the Wager. But yeah, it's all over the place. Here at the college, we read this text in 2 places, actually. We read it in the junior seminar, of course, in the fall, but we do so in the context of the Pensées as a whole, this whole book. We read it in, I think, 2 seminars of about 110 pages per seminar. The Wager makes up 5 of those pages, so 5 out of a 220-page reading. We also introduce it to high school students in our 2-week summer program where we just read the Wager in isolation as a standalone text. So the fact that we're able to introduce that little text to relatively unformed minds is a sign that its overall sense is not too difficult to grasp. But in my experience teaching both junior seminar and in the high school program, it's difficult to engage in a real detailed analysis of just the Wager itself. In the junior year, we don't have the luxury of spending a whole bunch of time on 5 pages when there's 220 other pages to read. And in the high school program, we have the time, but the students aren't quite yet intellectually disciplined enough to do a close read of a text line by line. So it's always kind of frustrated me that we just don't have a chance to kind of be careful and figure out what exactly this guy is saying here. So whenever I teach it, I kind of go back and forth to thinking that the argument doesn't hang together at all, on the one hand, and feeling like I'm just on the cusp of understanding it on the other. Usually when this argument is presented in either in intro to philosophy courses or in popular culture, it's kind of reduced to something like a 4-box decision matrix. I don't know if you've seen that, where, believe in God, this happens, don't believe in God, this happens, and this sort of 4 possible outcomes. I find that approach to be a little reductionist, and I've always been motivated to look more carefully at exactly what's said here and how it's said, and because I want to understand the argument better. So I finally did that this year, and this talk is the result. I won't have time to engage, obviously, the entire context of the Pensées. I won't even really have time to read through the entire section under the heading Infinity, Nothing. I'll just have enough time to work through the part that comprises the central part of the argument, which he puts in terms of the mathematics of wagering. I'll read through that part line by line, or at least thought by thought, kind of in the manner of a traditional commentary. So we'll pick out a chunk that I think is intelligible. I'll say some things about it, then we'll move on to the next chunk. That's what you have in front of you. So the numbered paragraphs are just the entirety of the argument in its continuity. So that's the whole thing. I'm not skipping around. That's beginning to end. That's what I'm going to comment on. But I just wanted you to have it so we had a nice reference for it. And since I'm coming at this with some background in probability theory as well as some real-world experience with decision making as a gambler, I've called the talk, Pascal's Wager, a Gambler's Commentary. My thesis is this, that the argument from the expected value of the decision does hang together when its terms are understood, at least from a mathematical perspective, but that the argument is also open to several objections as well, and I will highlight one objection that I think is probably the most damaging, or at least from the perspective of probability theory. So like I said, when this text is presented in an introductory survey of philosophy, the wager is often discussed alongside other arguments for God's existence, like Anselm's ontological argument, St. Thomas's 5 ways, etc. And it makes some sense, I guess, to think of the wager in this general context, since Pascal says in his introductory remarks, I'm going to quote not from that part, a little bit before that part. He says, "Let us then examine the point, and let us say either God is, or he is not. But to which view shall we be inclined?" So at least the general theme is one of God's existence, at least the question of God's existence. But his approach is not one of proof or demonstration. That becomes evident when he immediately follows the above question by saying, reason cannot decide this question. You'll never hear St. Thomas say, reason cannot decide this question, right? Or he might say it about the incarnation or the Trinity, but he won't say it about God's existence. Pascal says this because just before having introduced the question of God's existence, he had said this. This is a longer quote, also not on your page. "We do not know either the existence or the nature of God, because he neither has extension nor limits. If there is a God, he is infinitely beyond our comprehension, since, being indivisible and without limits, he bears no relation to us. We are therefore incapable of knowing either what he is or whether he is. That being so, who would dare to attempt to answer the question? Certainly not we, who bear no relation to him." Now, of course, this doesn't mean he has nothing more to say about the question. He ultimately does seem to want to convince his reader in this fragment that it is reasonable to believe in God, or at least it's reasonable to live the life of one who believes in God. But what is his approach if he doesn't think it possible to prove the existence of God? Well, his very next line tells us his approach. He says, "Infinite chaos separates us. At the far end of this infinite distance, a coin is being spun, which will come down heads or tails. How will you wager? Reason cannot make you choose either. Reason cannot prove either wrong." So, we need to make a decision about the existence of God, but reason cannot make us choose, he says. So, what is left? Well, it seems he's already hinted at the approach by his introduction of the metaphor of the coin. He will address the decision through a game of chance. Now, we probably all know that Pascal was a polymath, meaning he was someone with advanced knowledge across many fields of study, philosophy, theology, physics, mathematics. So his interests and his influence were quite broad. It's even said that he was the inventor of modern public transportation, because he designed a system of carriages that ran throughout Paris on a regular schedule, which was apparently the first of its kind. Of course, we encounter some of Pascal's mathematical works here at the college. We see his contribution to the use of the binomial theorem, which gave his name to what we now call Pascal's triangle, though he didn't discover Pascal's triangle. It was widely known before him. And of course, in the past, Mr. Andres probably remembers, we used to read his treatise on projective geometry in senior math, when Mrs. Guston was teaching that class anyway, which was a work that gave further insight into the properties of conic sections beyond what we learned from Apollonius and Descartes. But more relevant to today's subject, Pascal was a pioneer in probability theory. He used to correspond with his friend Fermat, who was also another famous mathematician of the time, about the decision-making problems faced by professional gamblers. So, in this work, The Wager, Pascal finds an application of the mathematics of probability to one of life's ultimate decisions, whether to live a life that reflects belief in God. In other words, in Pascal's mind, where traditional proofs of God's existence could only fail to convince the mind, an appeal to the reasoning of a gambler might produce results. So, Pascal is directing his argument to those who might be able to think like gamblers. But how do gamblers think? And why is this an appropriate way to approach the problem of God's existence? I'm going to assume, other than you poker players out there, that we're going to need a little primer in gambling theory to understand the components that go into making decisions like those faced by gamblers. The first thing that we need to recognize is that professional gamblers think about betting a little differently from your average guy on a bachelor party trip to Vegas. Professional gamblers are not looking to get lucky in a few hours at the roulette table over the weekend. They are looking to make decisions that are guaranteed to be profitable to them in the long run. But this, of course, presents a problem. How can something that depends on uncertain outcomes, like dice or cards, be knowable? A statement about future contingent things can either be true or false. So what sort of knowledge can there be about such things that allows us to make decisions in the present? This is the kind of thinking that Pascal wants to take advantage of in application to the problem of belief. Now, the math involved in gambling theory isn't all that difficult. If you've ever played a game of cards for money, or especially if you've ever bet on horses or sports in a serious way, you've certainly encountered at least the basics of this math. Like I said, the poker players might find this initial section a little basic, but in my experience with reading Pascal's Wager with students, high school students and juniors, most of us are not trained to think like this. And so my plan here is to just introduce the concepts slowly from the very beginning. It might seem slow, but it'll ramp up, I promise. So after establishing some basics, I'll begin to comment on Pascal's application. All right, let's start real simple before we introduce any technical mathematical language. So we've got two friends, let's suppose, and they are betting on the outcome of the simplest possible event, a coin flip. Let's call them Adam and Bob. The coin has two sides, heads and tails. Pascal, by the way, in his French text, calls it a cross and a stack. I guess there was a cross instead of a head on the front of a coin in his day. Let's suppose, did I say Adam or Andy? Adam. I think I changed it to Andy throughout the rest of the text. So I'm going to say Andy. Suppose Andy bets on heads. Andy bets on heads. Bob bets on tails. And suppose that they each bet the same amount. So each player puts $1 into the pot. I happen to have $1 here. This is a legitimate $1 chip from the Colorado Bell in Nevada. And this is a $1 chip from the Bicycle Casino down in Bell Gardens, California. Andy, and Bob. And they're going to each put $1 into the pot. This is the pot right there. Pot is now $2. Once you wager, that money is no longer yours. Once it leaves your hand, it does not belong to you. It belongs to the pot. Ultimately, it belongs to the winner of the wager. Okay. So at this point, we have a wager. And the result of the coin flip will determine who receives the contents of the pot. Now, this is a simple wager. Obviously, we don't need much probability theory to work things out. So first thing we have to presume is that the coin is fair. Fair means it has an equal likelihood of landing on heads or tails. It's statistically negligible that it will land on its side, even though that was the premise of a Twilight Zone episode, I think. If we flip the coin and it lands on heads, Andy wins the $2 pot. for a total win of $1. Remember, he wagered $1 and he got $2 back. 2 minus 1 is 1. He wins $1 net, right? And Bob loses $1. His dollar went over here. Now, notice this. If we just ended things right there, we flipped the coin one time, we wouldn't have much to talk about. One man would win, the other would lose, then we'd all go home. But Pascal developed this mathematics for professional gamblers who, by definition, always have a next bet. They don't quit when they're ahead. They don't quit when they're behind in the short run. It's their livelihood to realize their expectation in the long run. So Andy and Bob, of course, are gamblers. And so, of course, they make another bet. They each wager another $1. Bob, Andy. This one's from The Wynn in Las Vegas. This is from Commerce Casino down in Los Angeles. We have another $2 pot. Flip the coin again. Suppose this time it lands on tails. Now Bob wins the $2 pot. Bob profits $1 on that flip. Andy loses $1. But we're not done, because after each flip of the coin, we can actually calculate their total amount won or lost. So after 2 coin flips, Andy and Bob have each staked $2 and each won one $2 pot. Thus, they've both broken even over the 2 flips of the coin. But they're gamblers. They don't like to quit after 2 flips. So let's say they keep going to 10 flips of the coin. Now, the most likely result here is that after 10 flips, the coin will produce 5 heads and 5 tails. The 2 men will break even again. But we can also intuit that that's not a necessary outcome. It's possible when you flip a coin 10 times that heads could come up 3 times, 4 times, 6 times, 7 times, any number of times, really. But it is a principle of probability that as the number of events, that is, number of coin flips, increases, the ratio of the number of one outcome to the total number of events will approach the material probability assigned to that event. So that's the first thing we have to grasp here. If the material likelihood of the coin flip is equal, that means there's no weight or anything that's going to make it come up heads or tails more often than the other. If the material likelihood of the coin flip is equal for each outcome, then as the number of coin flips gets very large, the number of outcomes on each side will approach equality. Another way to say this is that outcomes of small sample sizes do not represent true probabilities. It's easy to flip a coin and have it come up heads twice in a row. That happens all the time. It's impossible to flip a coin 1,000,000 times in a row and not have the number of heads be very, very, very close to the number of tails. That's a principle. There's an old joke about that, by the way. Suppose you flip a coin 10 times and it comes up heads 10 times. Gamblers will react in one of 3 ways. The inexperienced gambler will say, well, the next flip is more likely to be tails because it's come up heads so many times. Tails is due. The more experienced gambler says, well, the past has no effect on the future, and therefore the next flip is just as likely to be heads as it is to be tails. And the professional gambler says, let me see that coin. So if our gamblers continue flipping the coin, Andy and Bob, they love flipping the coin, presuming that the coin is fair, they do it 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 times, the more they play, the more they can expect to break even. So this is where we introduce the language of expectation. They can expect to break even the more they flip the coin. Now this is really boring. No real gambler would waste his time making money on even bet coin flips because he didn't get into gambling to break even. Now let's suppose Andy is our professional gambler and he knows that Bob just gambles for the thrill of it and loves to bet big. So Andy appeals to Bob's love of big bets to convince his friend to wager $2 on every coin flip, and Andy only has to wager $1 on every coin flip. So they stake their wages, and now the pot is $3. And let's flip the coin and suppose it comes up tails. Bob wins. And he's excited because under the old wager, he only would have won $2, but now he's won $3. So his strategy paid off. Bet big, win big. Suppose they flip again, and it comes up tails again. Bob is on a roll. He now has $6. But again, we can see without too much calculation here that even though Bob is getting lucky here, getting tails in the first 2 flips, his expected value is actually negative. That's what we mean by expected value, or EV. It is the rate of win that is approached as the number of occurrences of the event increases. So even though Bob started out on a little hot streak here by winning the first 2 flips, if they continue to flip the coin 1,000 times, Bob is statistically guaranteed, or very nearly so, to come out a loser despite his early luck. This is where Pascal comes in. In fact, we can calculate Bob's expected value exactly with some simple math. So for each flip of the coin, there's $3 in the pot. On average, the coin will come up tails for Bob 50% of the time. That means for every $3 pot, Bob will, on average, earn half of that. Because half of the times it'll go to Andy, half of the time it'll go to Bob. But remember, Bob's putting in $2 every time, and his portion of the pot is expected only to be $1.50. Not that he's going to win $1.50 on any given flip, because you can't win $1.50 in a $3 pot. But on average, over time, he's expected to win half of every pot. If every pot is $3, then his expectation per pot is $1.50. So he's losing 50 cents every time he wagers. He's betting 2 and expected to win $1.50. Andy is gaining 50 cents on every bet. Even if he doesn't win this bet or that one, on average, his expectation or expected value is positive 50 cents. All right, that's enough of that silly coin flipping. That gives us the tools that we need to analyze any simple wager. So let's look at the components of a wager, and then we'll introduce a little more technical language here. So every wager has the following components. It has an event, some event with uncertain outcomes. And it has determined likelihoods of each outcome. I'm going to call that the event odds for reasons that will become clear. The event odds are the likelihoods of each outcome of the event. So in the coin flip, the event odds are 1 head to 1 tail. And I'll talk about exactly how we're going to express that in just a minute. So that's 2 things. It has an event with uncertain outcomes. It has determined likelihoods of each outcome, And then it has a stake, or an amount wagered by each player. And I'll call that the money odds, or the pot odds. So we have event odds. That's the likelihood of the outcome of the actual event that you're betting on. Then the money odds, or the pot odds, that's the ratios of the amounts that are actually wagered on the event. Those are independent, right? Because we saw that in the same coin flip, you could have even wagers or uneven wagers. So the coin flip doesn't determine the money odds. The coin flip only has its own event odds. So therefore, every wager has an expected value, which is, at least in theory, calculable. Okay, so in our simple 2-player coin flip, we've identified these 2 kinds of odds. There's a couple different ways to express the ratio, so I just want to say how I'm going to do it here. Since the event, that is, in this case, it's the flip of a fair coin, has 2 outcomes, and the outcomes are equally likely, I could say the event odds are 50-50 or 1-to-1 or something like that, but it's going to become clear that I'd like to talk about this as a 2-to-1 situation. That means I'm going to give you the ratio between all possible outcomes, heads or tails, 2 possible outcomes, and one of the possible outcomes. So the ratio of all possible outcomes to the one that we want. So if I'm Andy betting on heads, the ratio is 2-to-1 because it's 2 possible outcomes to my heads, 1. I'll also define the money odds, or the pot odds, as the ratio between the total amount staked by all players, that is the money in the pot, so $3 in the pot in our latest example, the ratio between that and the amount staked by each one of the players. So Andy's money odds are 3-1 because he's wagering 1 to win 3. Bob's odds are 3-2 because he's wagering 2 to win 3. So notice that even though they have the same event odds, the same odds of the outcome, they have different money odds because they've chosen to bet differently. So again, we can intuit that when the money odds exceed the event odds, the player has a positive expectation, or sometimes we call that plus EV, positive expectation. And when the odds are reversed, the player has a negative expectation, or is minus EV, or negative EV. This is at the heart of the matter here. The entire aim of the professional gambler is to put himself in plus EV situations. Because if he could do so with regularity in all of his gambling engagements, he would be guaranteed to be profitable in the long run. By in the long run, I mean over many, many, many repeated bets. So that's kind of the heart of the matter here in terms of the math of this stuff. It's not hard, but it's worth getting your mind around. Because Pascal complicates things, I'm going to complicate things just before I get to talking about Pascal. I promise we'll get there. So we could add some complexity to our event without really changing the math at all. So suppose Andy and Bob are tired of flipping this coin, and they want to get on to something really interesting like rolling dice. So Andy's the professional. He knows what's going on. Bob is the wild one. Bob likes betting big and winning big. So Andy is going to convince Bob somehow that he's going to bet $1 that a 6 will come up on the die. He's going to give Bob all the rest. 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All Bob has to do to engage the bet is bet 6 chips, $6. Andy bets 1, Bob bets 6. Andy only wins when a 6 comes up. That's not going to happen very often. Bob's going to win a lot. Bob loves to win. So who's in charge here? Who's going to win? Well, it's going to be Andy again for the same exact reason, although the math is slightly different. Andy will lose 5 rolls out of 6. But when his number 6 comes up, he's going to win a $7 pot. Every time the 6 comes up, he's going to lose his $1, he's going to lose his $1, he's going to lose his $1. But when that 6 comes up, he wins a $7 pot. Now notice that the event odds for Andy are 6-1. Sorry, 5-1. No, 6-1. 6-1. And his pot odds are 7-1. So as we said, when the pot odds exceed the event odds, it's a positive expectation, a plus EV, positive expected value decision. In fact, we can calculate the exact amount. It's just 7 divided by 6. So it's Andy's expectation on every roll of the die is $1.17. And Bob's expectation is negative. Or actually, Andy's is positive, just 17 cents, because he's already bet the $1, so it's just 17 cents. So it's not a lot, but do it a lot, the money adds up. I could do the same thing if I were to have a 60-sided die. I don't have 60 chips, so I won't do the whole performative thing, but let's suppose Andy decides to convince Bob to bet on his 60-sided die. Andy will win when it comes up 60. Bob will win when it comes up whenever. So Bob's just going to be winning all the time, raking it in, raking it in, raking it in. But remember, Andy's the smart one. He's going to bet $1, and Bob has to bet $60 on every bet. Again, the edge is slight. There's a $61 pot. So Andy is getting 61-1 on his money, but he's getting 60-1 on his event odds. 61-1 is better than 60-1, slightly. So he has a 2-cent expectation on every roll, meaning he's going to benefit in the long run. Every time you roll the die, he's going to benefit 2 cents. Mostly he's going to lose. He's going to lose 59 times out of 60. But the one time he wins a $61 pot, and that's enough to cover all of his losing, as long as they run it for a long time. Okay, I'm tired of that. One last thing before we turn to Pascal. Oh, one other thing. I want to introduce a little bit of language that Pascal will take advantage of. So this fact about positive expectation, that's what makes decisions to enter into such gambling situations to be called correct. And that's why Pascal will use the language of right and wrong, if we ever get to his text. The single thing that defines the professional gambler as such is that he identifies betting situations that have a positive expectation, making it the right or correct decision to wager. That's the kind of language Pascal will be using eventually here. Okay, one last thing, though, before we turn to Pascal. So it might seem unlikely to us that Andy could convince someone like Bob to give him favorable odds on a simple coin flip or a roll of the dice like we've described. But this is precisely how casinos operate. They prey on the passions. They give players an apparently attractive proposition, but then they design their games exactly like the way we designed our games, with a slight advantage in their favor. So they always have a slightly positive expectation, and are guaranteed to come out ahead in the long run. That's why they print money in Las Vegas. Now, individual professional gamblers generally avoid these kinds of standard casino games, like roulette and slots, and they direct their attention to finding situations where they are the ones with the positive expectation. So that might be, they might study how horse races are bred and trained so that they feel like they can make a bet that's got a positive expectation on a horse race, or they might know something about a team sport where they can make a bet with a positive expectation. They might know how to locate lucrative poker games like Saints Peter and Paul. So the calculation of expected value obviously gets a little more complicated in horse racing and sports betting when there's a lot more unknown factors. In coins and dice, you know exactly what the numbers are. I don't have time to talk about how all that stuff works. It's really fascinating, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I just want to lay out the basic math of how it all works. And I am not advocating all this stuff as a lifestyle. I'm just telling you how the math works. All right, now we're ready to go back to Pascal. So in the remainder of the talk, I will comment on the probability-based portion of the text that we call the wager, from the perspective of the gambler to whom Pascal is addressing his argument. The mode of my presentation is just going to be to read a section of the text and then explain what I think is going on. All right, text number 1 on your sheet. There's one right here. He says, "Yes, but you must wager. There is no choice. You are already committed. Which will you choose then? Let us see. Since a choice must be made, let us see which offers you the least interest." So Pascal begins by responding to a previous objection from his interlocutor that in the matter of belief in God, the correct decision is not to wager at all. The interlocutor said this, "I will condemn men not for having made this particular choice, but any choice at all, for although the one who calls heads and the other are equally at fault, the fact is that they are both at fault. The right thing is not to wager at all." So presumably the opponent is advocating some sort of agnostic position here about the existence of God, but Pascal reminds him that the issue at hand is not one of intellectual assent or not to the existence of God, but rather of one of how you must decide to live. Since you are alive, you are living a life, you're already committed to the game, you must live in a certain way. There's no opting out. So we have to decide which life is preferable. Text number 2. "You have 2 things to lose, the true and the good, and 2 things to stake, your reason and your will, your knowledge and your happiness, and your nature has 2 things to avoid, error and wretchedness. Since you must necessarily choose, your reason is no more affronted by choosing one rather than the other. That is one point cleared up. But your happiness, let us weigh up the gain and the loss involved in calling heads that God exists." So here Pascal begins to put the decision in terms familiar to the gambler. We've got loss, we've got stake. He sets up a series of parallel things of value, one group on the side of our knowing power and the other on the side of our desiring power. So the true, knowledge, reason, error, those all go to one side, and the good, will, happiness, and wretchedness on the other. And they all kind of match up there. He says, however we decide, our reason will not be offended, since he has already established that we cannot reason either way on the question. That is, we cannot prove God's existence with human reason. Therefore, the gambler has only to concern himself with matters of the good, that is, his will, his happiness, and his wretchedness. Text number 3. Let us assess the two cases. If you win everything. If you lose nothing. Do not hesitate then. Wager that he does exist. That is wonderful. This is the response to that. It's in quotes there. That is wonderful. Yes, I must wager, but perhaps I am wagering too much. Pascal responds to that by saying, let us see. Since there is an equal chance of gain and loss, if you stood to win only 2 lives, for 1 you could still wager. Okay, now he's talking our language, right? We just got done learning all about this stuff, and we're ready to figure out what's going on. Notice that Pascal is identifying the essential elements of the wager that we just introduced. His audience, the gambler, will recognize these immediately. We've got an event with an uncertain outcome, namely, whether God exists, or perhaps more crucially, how one will spend eternity based on your decision on that matter. 2, we've got event odds, and he's here assuming that the situation is like a coin flip. That is, there's 2 outcomes and they are both equal. Now notice not every 2-outcome event has equal chances, right? Sporting events have a 2-outcome event. One team is going to win or the other team is going to win, but oftentimes one team is much stronger than the other, so it's not an equal likelihood that one of the events will come in and will happen. But in a coin flip, it is likely. And he thinks because we can't decide one way or the other, we're not allowed to use any reason here, no evidence, it either yes or no, then it's the same as a coin flip. And so the math is the same as a coin flip. And then we've got the money odds, and that's where he's going to talk. So what does Pascal mean here by win and lose in quote number 3? He tells us in the next sentence, wager that he exists. So what does it mean to wager that he exists? It means to live the life of a believer. Now, this is another possible point of objection that we're not going to take up here, but what does it mean to live like a believer? Does that mean to live like a Catholic or a Jansenist or Orthodox or Muslim or a Jew? So this is usually called the many gods objection to the wager. But later, after the text that we're dealing with is over, he tells us what the life of belief looks like. He says, behave just as if they did believe, taking holy water, having masses said, and so on. So he's clearly speaking in a Catholic context here. He's talking about holy water and mass, maybe Orthodox as an outside. But his audience is clearly contemporary, French, probably baptized, but probably lapsed Catholic. That's who he's talking to here. So we can really dismiss the many gods argument pretty easily by just saying this, that. He's not talking to those people. He might have a different argument for those people. He's talking to lapsed Catholics here. And so presumably living the life of the taking holy water and having masses said would also involve giving up what he later in a text calls noxious pleasures. So drinking, chasing girls, maybe even gambling. Okay, so that's why I think Pascal puts the stake, that is what is wagered, what you put forth into the pot here, what you were willing to give up, the stake, he puts that in terms of lives. So remember back in text 3 that we just read, he said, if you stood to win only 2 lives for 1, you could still wager. So he's saying to wager that God exists means staking or giving up a life that's displeasing to God, if he exists, and to live a life pleasing to him. Now, to his audience guy, the guy who understands gambling well, that might be risky. So the stake is your life, your one life. That's your stake, or at least your lifestyle. In that same text, number 3, when he says, if you stood to win only 2 lives for 1, you could still wager, what he's saying there is that the event odds and the money odds are the same. That's because we're betting on an event that's just the same as a coin flip. God exists, God doesn't exist. We have no way of determining which one of those is more likely. Remember, reason, can't use it. If you wager on a coin flip and you're getting 2-to-1 on your money, by the gambler's calculus, that is an EV neutral decision, neutral expected value. That's just like the thing we started with, where these guys were going back and forth flipping coins for $1 each, and nobody was winning any money. The expectation is 0, meaning you don't expect to win in the long run, you don't expect to lose. So when he says you could still wager, there at the end of the third text there, that's what he's saying, I think, that he's speaking in terms of the gambler's logic. You could still wager. You can bet on a 0 EV situation. No harm done. Then text 4, he says, but supposing you stood to win 3. You would have to play, since you must necessarily play, and it would be unwise of you, once you're obliged to play, not to risk your life in order to win 3 lives at a game in which there's an equal chance of winning and losing. So now he puts himself in Adam's situation. He says, if you just give up 1 life, but you could win 3, we've just kicked up the bet. We've kicked up the money odds. Event odds are still the same. We're still flipping a coin, but you're now in the calculus of the gambler, you're ready to win 3 and only risking a situation of 2. So we've got an EV positive EV situation. Remember that to be profitable, the gambler must be able to identify 3 possible outcomes: positive expected value, neutral expected value, negative expected value. The gambler, as such, must not ever wager when the expectation is negative. He can wager or not when the expectation is neutral, and he must wager when the expectation is positive. As a gambler, he must wager. So this is central to what it is to be of a gambler, to put oneself into the profitable or positive EV side of a wager. And when a gambler finds an EV positive situation, he must, as a gambler, take the bet. Pascal already has identified a situation where you stood to win only 2 lives as an EV neutral proposition, where the gambler could wager. So he simply increases the money odds here by 1 unit, the smallest possible increase, by supposing that you could win 3 lives. I'm not quite sure what it would mean to win 3 lives, but he's just doing the math here. Any situation in which the money odds are greater than the event odds has a positive expectation, and therefore he says to his gambler, you would have to play. So he restates his reasoning here in this section 4, right? He says, it would be unwise of you not to risk your life in order to win 3 lives at a game in which there is an equal chance of winning and losing. So he's saying what we've been saying all along. When the money odds exceed the event odds, it would be unwise not to take the risk according to the wisdom of the gambler. It'd be unwise. The gambler's wisdom, positive expectation. In the next section, section 5, he seems to increase his argument a fortiori by saying that the actual money odds are not 2-to-1, they're not 3-to-1, but infinity to 1. Since what you stand to gain is no simple multiple of what you're risking, but it's infinite. So here's what he says in 5. That being so, even though there were an infinite number of chances of which only 1 were in your favor, that's like this guy. This is a situation where there are 60 chances and only 1 in Andy's favor. Imagine this being an infinite-sided die. I guess that would be a sphere, according to Galileo, anyway. So even though there were an infinite number of chances, only 1 of which were in your favor, you would still be right to wager 1 in order to win 2, and you would be acting wrongly, being obliged to play, in refusing to stake 1 life against 3 in a game, where out of an infinite number of chances there is 1 in your favor, if there were an infinity of infinitely happy life to be won. Now, I think there's a couple of strange moves in this section. I'm getting there, don't worry. When he says, even though there were an infinite number of chances, of which there were only 1 in your favor, okay, so now he's changing the game from a coin flip to something more like an infinitely sided die of some sort. So he says you have to choose 1 out of an infinite number of chances. Okay, so we're not flipping coins anymore. We're rolling many, many-sided die. And he says you would still be right to wager on these odds, Now we can call these odds infinity to 1. That would be the event odds. Now remember, this was 2 to 1, this was 6 to 1, this was 60 to 1. He's ramped it all the way up to infinity to 1, and he still says, even if the event odds are infinity to 1 against you winning, you would still be right to wager, because the prize for winning, if your number comes up, is of infinite worth. And then I think he states the case even stronger. Oh, no, sorry. Yeah, I said it already. He states the case stronger by saying you would be acting wrongly in refusing to wager. The second strange thing he says here is that what we stand to win is an infinity of infinitely happy life. It seems like now he's saying not only are there an infinite number of lives to be won, whatever that would mean, but the quality of that life is infinitely happy. So he's introduced not just a quantitative infinity, but a qualitative infinity of some sort. I guess that's just to ramp up the winnings, I guess. So I guess this is why he says it would be wrong not to wager. Because remember, if the event odds and the money odds are equal, like in our coin flip where everybody bets $1, the gambler could play or not play. So if we have infinity to 1 odds and we stand to win infinity, that would be like having 2 to 1 odds and standing to win 2. It would be a break-even bet. But by saying that the quality of the life that you stand to win is infinitely happy, it seems like he's pushing the wager from a break-even wager to a positive expected value wager. It's like saying it's 2 to 1, but the pot contains this gorgeous Colorado Bell token, and that's just a much more beautiful dollar than the other dollars. So there's a qualitative extra bonus win there. All right, text 6. But here there is an infinity of infinitely happy life to be won, one chance of winning against a finite number of chances of losing, and what you're staking is finite. That leaves no choice. Wherever there's infinity, and where there are not infinite chances of losing against that of winning, there's no room for hesitation. You must give everything. And thus, since you are obliged to play, you must be renouncing reason if you hoard your life rather than risk it for an infinite gain, just as likely to occur as a loss amounting to nothing. So here he keeps the money odds the same. We still have an infinity of infinitely happy life to be won. But it seems like here he's dialing back the event odds. He's not saying we have one chance in an infinity to win. He's saying, let's call it a coin flip again. So we aren't really rolling an infinitely sided die, but we're just betting on one of only 2 possible outcomes. Remember, the point is that this is God exists or God doesn't exist. It's not really that you have 1 out of an infinity of chances. You have 1 out of 2 chances to win. So in gambling terms, we're getting infinity to 1 on our money on a 2 to 1 bet proposition. Given those odds, the gambler is obliged to bet. And I think that's the end of that line of argumentation. It seems like there's a lot of text left to deal with, but I'm going to deal with it fairly quickly because I think it's a simple argument and Pascal doesn't spend much time on it. He says, for it's no good saying, this is text number 7, it's no good saying that it is uncertain whether you will win, that it is certain that you are taking a risk, and that the infinite distance between the certainty of what you are risking and the uncertainty of what you may gain makes the finite good you are certainly risking equal to the infinite good that you are not certain to gain. That has been the hardest text for me to understand, but I think it's relatively simple. I think it's just an objection that Pascal is putting forward on behalf of his interlocutor. It seems to be the objection of anyone who is averse to the risks associated with gambling. Someone like this might argue that they have a certain good in hand, and by the very fact that the proposition of winning is uncertain, it doesn't matter whether what they stand to win is infinitely good, because the distance between certainty and uncertainty is the same as the difference between the finite good that they currently have and the infinite good that they are not certain to win. Well, that's just not how gamblers reason. Pascal answers the objection. He says, every gambler, this is text number 8, every gambler takes a certain risk for an uncertain gain, and yet he is taking a certain finite risk for an uncertain finite gain without sinning against reason. Here, there's no infinite distance between the certain risk and the uncertain gain. That is not true. I'm not going to go through the rest of that text because we're getting short on time, but I think he's just saying this objection is just saying that why should I risk what I have for something uncertain? And he says, well, every gambling decision is about the uncertainty of an outcome, yet we can be certain that it's the right gambling decision. So So he says in text 9, this is conclusive and men are capable of any truth. If men are capable of any truth, this is it. So he rests his case. Now I'm going to raise one objection and make a brief conclusion, and then we'll call it a day. Many scholars have made many of the possible objections to this sort of argument. I'm going to focus on one that strikes me specifically in the context of the decision-making of the gambler. Something that often gets overlooked in the calculus of expectation is a concept that sometimes gets called the risk of ruin. And here's what I mean by that. Remember that the argument from expected value depends on something very important. That is, it depends on the event odds of any given outcome, the fact that the event odds of any given outcome approach the probability of that event as the number of instances of the event increases. That is, the professional gambler is able to make decisions based on expected value, not because he expects to win every time, and he doesn't expect to win every coin flip, but he still makes the bet. Why? Because a property of any situation that has been determined to be positive expectation, plus EV, is that every time he does win, he wins enough to cover the times that he loses, and more besides. So a hidden premise then of every calculation of expected value is that there must be enough future events at the same expected value so that the actual event outcomes can approach the limit of the probability of the event. Here's what I mean by that. Suppose we go back to Andy and Bob and their uneven coin flip bet. So Andy wagers 1, Bob wagers 2, the coin flip is 50-50, so Andy has a positive expectation of 50 cents. We already did that calculation. Bob has the corresponding negative expectation. Remember that to calculate this, we had to suppose that the two men were willing to flip the coin not just once, not just 10 times, but 100 or 1,000 or more times in order to make that claim that we made about expected value. Now we can make this point clear by making one minor alteration to the bet. So instead of asking Andy to wager $1, suppose Bob asks Andy to wager $1 million, and that's his entire net worth. Now, Bob is still going to offer to double Andy's wager. He's a great guy. He loves betting, so Bob's going to bet $2 million. Now, Bob's independently wealthy, so he can afford it. But Andy's entire net worth is now in the pot. The expected value calculation that we made is exactly the same as it was when it was $1 versus $2. It's just $1 million versus $2 million. Andy is still getting 3-to-1 on his money for a coin flip, which is a 2-to-1 proposition. So he's getting 3-to-1 on a 2-to-1. That's the definition of positive expected value. Pascal reminds us then whenever we encounter a situation like that, we are obliged to wager. Remember? But now, since Andy is being asked to risk his whole net worth, if the coin flip happens to fall on tails, Bob will win. Andy will have no more money left with which to recoup his losses in future wagers. Therefore, the expected value cannot be the only factor in making gambling decisions. So Pascal seems to be making this mistake here in his presentation. He's asking his gambler to make a decision using the calculation of expected value alone, but fails to take account of the risk of ruin. If his gambler bets his life, that is, bets all he has on God's existence and loses, even if his expected value is positive for the decision, he will not have a chance to realize that expectation in future gambling events because he will be dead and God does not exist under that scenario. Because this is a one-time offer, and by definition, gambling decisions depend on the ability to multiply events, the logic doesn't work, at least that is as far as that goes. Now, it's possible that Pascal saw this objection and intended to deal with it before his work was published, because remember, this was the state that we found it in. So in my mind, if his argument contained nothing but the gambler's analysis, we must conclude it to be a failure. But something he says as he's wrapping up the wager might be placed here just to mitigate his argument somewhat. This is a quote that's not on your sheet. He says, "Now what harm will come from you choosing this course, that is, living your life as if God exists? You will be faithful, honest, humble, grateful, full of good works, a sincere, true friend. It is true you will not enjoy noxious pleasures, glory, and good living, but will you not have others? I tell you that you will gain even in this life, and that at every step you take along this road, you will see that your gain is so certain and your risk so negligible that in the end you will realize that you have wagered on something certain and infinite for which you have paid nothing. Well, that's nice, I suppose. Here he says that the life lost by betting on the existence of God, which, remember, would be giving up pleasure, glory, and wealth, is not really a loss at all, even if God does not exist. In fact, life without pursuing these so-called goods is even better than the life the gambler is supposedly living right now. But to me, this seems a bit like gambling with monopoly money. If there's really nothing to lose, and all the more if you think that a loss is really a win, then it makes me wonder whether there was really any need for the gambling analysis at all. Thank you.